Can you hear me? Oh, not today this is working. The day that I don't need it as bad. Of course. Okay, well, I'm still going to do it because the audio wasn't very good on my testing or any of these going down. There we go. Okay. I'm still going to do it because the audio is not very good on my recording, but that's okay. Outcomes. You look like I'm done. You're out for the semester. Okay, let's get started. So guess what? That was our last grade until the exam, other than your participation grades. So that's exciting. I am hoping to have your quizzes and your tests back to you by tomorrow so that you can calculate what you need to get on the final to get the grade that you want in this class. Remember, the final is worth 15% of your grade, I believe, but also the final will replace your lowest test grade. So if your lowest test grade you're not happy with, but you can show that you've mastered the material by the final, then I will replace your lowest test grade with the final grade. Okay, so, and then the other thing is, don't forget there's extra credit opportunity. If you're worried about your grade, you have to turn in your chemistry is for everyone essay before the final exam. And then you can also come to my office hours and you get 2 extra credit points on your final grade at the end of the semester. And am I missing anything else? I think that's everything. Yes. Yeah, so you have 3 exam grades and I'll drop one of them. And of those 2 kept ones, so like say you got a 90, an 85, and an 80. So then we'll keep the 90 and the 85. And then if you get a 100 on your final, I'll replace the 85 with your 100. And then I'll add the 10 points to the other one. So your total would be a 100 average. So there's still a lot of room to make up for any misunderstandings you had early on, because my goal for you is not that you get it perfectly as we go through, but by the end of the semester, you can demonstrate mastery. Yes. It's worth 15% of your grade, but so is your homework and so is class participation. So as long as you're getting at least a 50, it's still well within your range to get an A. It's worth more for you for me to add the 10 points to your exams, which are 30 or 35% of your grade, than for me to add anywhere else. So yeah, but if you do terribly on the final, I don't think it will hurt you that badly, but you stand to gain a lot to do well on the final. So, but like if you have an A right now, if all your grades are doing pretty well, And as long as you just get enough to keep the percentage of your final in the A. It's only 15% because I know that end of the semester final can really freak people out. But it also is like, it's only 15% unless you do well, and then it replaces your lowest test grade, and then it's worth more. You know what I mean? So I kind of try to mitigate that. Yes. Whatever it says on my rubric. I don't think I have a page length. I just want you to completely fill the brief of the essay. Any other questions about grades and finals? Yeah. It's 60 questions with 2 bonus questions. And at least one of those bonus questions is an NMR question. I was looking at it last night. I finished it up last night, and I decided to put the NMR question on there because if you are going into Dr. Berhay's class in summer 2, then you don't really need to worry about NMR too much. But for the ACS exam, he will give you bonus points if you know how to do NMR. So that's beneficial. And if you're going to Dr. Dandikar's class or Dr. Richmond's class for ochem 2 in the fall, if you're not doing summer 2, both Dr. Dandikar and Dr. Richmond expect you to have a thorough understanding of NMR. So I kind of tried to split the difference of preparing you for what was to come, depending on who your other teacher is. And then obviously, if you don't go to UNT, if you're going somewhere else for ochem 2, if you're going back to your home university and you're just here for the summer, I have no idea what those teachers expect of you. So what I did to kind of mitigate that is basically I have an overview of how to understand NMR lecture. This is exactly what I did give my students last fall. And then in the spring, one of my students had a professor who didn't go over it and they wanted me to cover it for them. So this is that basically. This is the lecture I would give you anyway, if you are interested in it. There's also a few notes on NMR, and then there's some practice problems. You don't have to turn these in, but I do want you to you know, if you're going to be in one of those classes where you're expected to know it, you're going to be responsible for your own education in this way, and you can, you know, figure out how many different signals you'll get and stuff. So that's kind of how I'm splitting the difference. I really want to finish chapter 8 today or tomorrow, and then start on chapter 10. I think what I'm going to do on Monday, there's, I was trying to think about, again, how to prepare you for next semester. And there are, usually Dr. Berhay, if you're doing summer 2, picks up right at chapter 11. So you won't be really missing out on too much. But Dr. Dandikar and Dr. Richmond usually expect you to have finished chapter 11. What's nice about chapter 11 is its reactions of alcohols and ethers. So you've already learned how to make alcohols, and you've already learned how to make ethers in what we've done in chapter 8. So a ton, and chapter 6 and 7. So a ton of what we've done already is actually in chapter 8, chapter 11. Most of chapter 11 is a review. And then there's also like reactions of alcohols, which you've also learned some of that, right? Like acid catalyzed dehydration. You already know how to do that. That's a reaction of an alcohol. So you've learned a lot of what's going to be covered in chapter 11. But I do think I might have said Monday, but on Tuesday, the beginning of next week, I will probably touch on that just to prepare those of you who are going in to be an ochem 1 not with me. And there's a few things that I do think it's really useful for you to know, like how to convert an alcohol into a good leaving group is in that chapter, and that will be on your final because that's useful in terms of substitution and elimination reactions. So we'll touch on those things Tuesday, and then Wednesday and Thursday we'll do a review, and I'm going to build your review primarily around the feedback I got from your participation question in lecture yesterday. Okay, great. So that's my plan. So we're skipping over chapter 9. If you're going to be in a class that expects you to know chapter 9, you have a lecture for me, but I'm not going to force all of you to learn it because you don't all have to learn it. And then we're going to finish up chapter 10. Students love chapter 10. It is really easy for whatever reason. It's radical reactions, and it's like I mean, if it's not easy for you, that's fine. But for most students, it's like, it just clicks and they're like, oh no, we haven't learned anything like this. And then they spend 20 minutes looking at it and it just clicks. So I don't think you need to worry too much about that. If you are worried about that, I went ahead and published like a little video on chapter 10, how radical reactions work, so you can prep yourself. This is basically equivalent to what I'm also going to cover in lecture, because again, I had students who didn't get it from their ochem 1 professor and they asked me to make a video about it. So you can get a pre-lecture lecture if you want. But chapter 10 usually clicks pretty quickly for students. Okay. Is everyone on board with the plan? Okay, so hopefully we'll finish 8 and 10 this week. On Tuesday, whatever we'll do, I like to call it cleaning up the details. We'll just touch on whatever we didn't get to. I'm going to show you what to expect from chapter 11. I'm going to show you how much of chapter 11 you actually already know, so you don't have to feel intimidated by it. That will help you as you go into Dr. Berhay's class as well, if you're taking ochem 2 in the summer. And yeah, how are you all feeling? Okay, so to prepare for the final then, since you know what to expect from class, I recommend you start preparing for the final now. Even if you're just doing a little bit every single day, you're not studying for an exam at the beginning of next week on purpose. I could have tested you on chapter 8 and 10. I didn't want to, because I wanted you to start studying for the final now. Studies really show that if you study a little bit at a time, that you will learn the information better. So I want you to start studying now, and start really getting that information in your mind. And part of also why I want you to do that, especially for ochem 1, is you're going to go back to chapter 1 and you're going to look at those practice problems. And most of you are going to think, why did I ever think this was hard? Because you've been doing all of the concepts from chapter 1 to 3 is a little bit weird because it's acid based, but we have been doing some of that. Curved arrows are in chapter 3. You've been doing a lot of those. Chapter 4 is nomenclature. You've been adding into nomenclature more and more as you've gone through. You're used to doing the ring to chair things. You're used to doing Newman projections. You've been doing a lot of what you've done from earlier chapters throughout this whole past week and a half since we covered it. It's gone so fast. But so I think you'll find when you go back to start reviewing those chapters that it will build your confidence actually. And also, I found that the hardest thing is for students to start. They feel like it's going to be so hard, so they put off starting, when if you just start, it gets a lot easier. So I really, 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 really want you to start studying now if you can, now that our grades are over. And I want you to start building your confidence and to see, oh, I know a lot more than I think I do. You have the advantage. This is the one place where summer has the advantage. You learned this stuff like 3 weeks ago. Like you were taking quizzes and tests on this 3 weeks ago. You barely had time to forget. So it's going to help you that we've done it so fast paced in preparation for your final. And on that note, I know that Monday is technically a holiday, but what I would recommend is if you scroll down to the bottom of your modules, I have a final exam review material. I didn't update this schedule because it's kind of unreasonable for us to update it, but in summer. But you can kind of see I have study tips on how to study for your final, and then like how to do practice problems, stuff like that. This was a schedule that I made for my students in the fall, where I was like, oh, do a chapter every single day and then you'll be ready. Obviously you can't quite do it like that, but you've also forgotten less than they'd forgotten. So however you want to adapt this to work for you, but I do recommend you kind of try to make a schedule and stick to it. And then the other thing I would change, I also have what I do for every chapter. Like this is how I study if I'm, going to study. So I have my like my chapter summary. I compare it to the PowerPoint to make sure I didn't miss anything. And then I go back and do practice problems. I make flashcards of anything that I'm really consistently forgetting. And then I do those flashcards all the time throughout. And then the other thing I would change from this to being in summer session is actually, I would have you do, instead of doing your practice exam a few days before your final, I think you should do a practice exam on Monday because it's a holiday and you can wake up at the time you normally wake up for class. You could even, I think campus will be locked, so I don't know if you want to drive to campus, but you can simulate the same morning that you would have on the day of the final, and then go sit in your room or whatever quiet space can simulate the room on final day and take the practice exam. So here's my practice exam that I have for you. If you take it on Monday and you take it with 2 hours, because that's how much time you'll have on the final, and you can look through exactly what you're getting right and wrong and grade it yourself, and then you will know what your weaknesses are. So this is really similar to the actual final you'll have. This technically I gave to my students last fall. So when I made it, they had already covered chapter 10. So there might be a few, or chapter 11. So there might be a few things from chapter 11 that we won't have touched on yet when you do this practice exam. The only things from chapter 11 that you'll need to know for your final is just converting alcohol to a good leaving group. I don't think I'm going to have anything else on there for you. If I missed a question and there is one, I'll drop it. I'm not going to grade you on something we didn't cover in class. And then, yeah, so I recommend you sit down, you take this practice final. It is 60 questions, just like your final is going to be. You'll have 2 hours to take your final, and there will actually be 2 bonus questions on your final, but it's very, very close. And it's very, very similar to these. I got these from the same test bank, from the same locations, from my brain. It's very, very similar. So I highly recommend you do that on Monday. Grade it, see what your areas of weakness are, and then you know where to hone in for Tuesday and Wednesday studying. I guess Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday studying, and you'll know what questions you need to ask me. And then also with the practice final, I spent 2 hours of my life making video keys for it. And for some reason, my camera that day just kept stopping. But I explained my thought process on every single question. So I talk about how I'm looking at this question. I'm looking at the reagents. I see that there's a positive, or like a good available hydrogen, and a negative. So this is probably going to be acid base. I see that there's a good leaving group, and I see that there's a good nucleophile. So this is probably going to be substitution or elimination, and then I can narrow it down. Or, hey, this starts with a double bond, and there are these reactions over here. So that makes me think this is an alkene reaction, right? So I talk about how I go through that process for every question to kind of help you think about what process to go through for yourself as well. But there is also just the key. So you can first grade yourself, and then you can go find the questions that you're doing poorly on and watch me think through them. By the end of it, I was like so out of breath and so exhausted. It took me so long to do it because I couldn't just sit quietly and work 60 questions, right? I was like narrating my thought process for every single question, and it was so exhausting. But I've actually gotten more good feedback on that than any of my other videos that I've ever made. People from other classes email me and are like, thank you so much for making this practice final. So I think students tend to find that really helpful. So that's how I would study for the final. All my tips, all my documents are available here. And then the other thing I have is just a brief review for every chapter of like, here's the main ideas that you need to know from this chapter. So, you know, for chapter 1, we didn't talk about isotopes very much, but we did talk about cis-trans bonds back then, and you guys were like, what the heck is this? I'm so confused. And now you're like, easy, no problem. Easy, get it? Resonance structures is one that students kind of struggle with, and that will come back on. And then hybridization, students usually don't struggle with that as much by the end. Don't feel like I'm a failure if you are struggling with that. That's not my intention, but just to kind of give you hope that it won't be so bad. And then, so I did that for every single chapter. So there's like chapter 5, all the major things you need to remember from chapter 5. I did the bullet point of the concepts for you, but then I want you to go fill in like your whole study sheet and make sure you understand all the little details. So like this is telling whether something's a stereoisomer or not. And then I also have be able to use Fisher projections to tell what the relationship between 2 molecules are. I think I might, did I leave off RNS configuration? Be able to identify a chiral center and assign RNS. So, you know, all those things are things that you are going to go have to fill in the details on, but I give you like a basic outline of what you need to know from every chapter. It's not intended to be comprehensive, just a starting point. And then I do have like challenge problems on the bottom of each one. so that you can kind of get used to practicing these practice problems again. And then you also have your practice problems for chapter by chapter. And then also, if you have it, the ACS Organic Chemistry Study Guide is a really good resource. The chapters are slightly different from ours, and you'll have to be able to recognize like, oh, this isn't something we went over yet. But like in the electrophilic edition, I was looking at that last night, and there are some that I'm like, oh, this is like a later chapter. It's a different type of electrophilic edition. So if you see that, don't freak out too much. But it is really, really good resource, especially on like stereoisomers, chapter 5, chapter 6, and 7. If you can answer those questions in the ACS study guide, you're going to be in really good shape. And I actually also like that one for acid base because it does a lot of like the inductive effect and telling functional groups that maybe aren't necessarily on the pKa table, stuff like that. Okay. Any other questions on how best to prepare for the final? Yeah. It's slightly more heavily weighted, I would say, towards chapter 8. Like if there was one that I'm like, oh, this is chapter 11, we didn't cover this, I replace it with chapter 8. I think there's like maybe a little bit more of chapter 10, but other than that, it's evenly distributed. So there's like formal charge questions on there, which that should be really easy for you at this point. There's hybridization questions on there, like the overlap of these results in what, right? That should be pretty easy for you. There's which side of the reaction is favored based on acid base. And then there's questions like predict the product of this, and it'll be like an substitution or elimination reaction followed by a hydrogenation or something, you know, where it's like a multi-step type of thing. So you'll get the whole range of different types of things. Or there's like, which of these would best favor substitution? Which of these would form the most stable carbocation? Like any kind of question you've seen on an exam is fair game, plus some for chapter 8 and 10. But it's mostly evenly distributed. It's just like slightly favored towards chapter 8 and 10 with a little bit more questions on those. That was a good question. Anything else? Okay. Great. Well, let's get started on chapter 8. So what have we learned from chapter 8? Oh, also, I was looking at my notes, and for some reason I'd uploaded the wrong PowerPoint for chapter 8. It was like a half done version that I must have saved in my downloads on accident or something. But this is the right one, and it's all of the chapter 8 notes. Like it covers everything. So if you found that and you're like, this doesn't match what she's showing me on the lecture video, that's why I uploaded the wrong one. But the right one is up now. Okay, so what did we learn so far from chapter 8? We did a little bit of chapter 8 on Monday after the exam, and then we did more of chapter 8 yesterday virtually. And I gave you some time to work on practice problems on that. What do you remember from it? What's chapter 8 about? I heard the word synthesize. Synthesize what? Synthesizing alkenes. So how do we know how to synthesize alkenes? E1 and E2, that's right. And what do you have to consider when you're looking at E1 and E2 reactions? This is a little bit of a review for your final. How exciting. Let's start with E1. What do you have to think about when you're doing an E1 reaction? What? That's how you can tell if it's E1 or E2. I would agree with that. You look at the nucleophile to be able to tell the difference. What else do you have to think about when you're doing E1 versus E2? Secondary and tertiary carbon is actually favored for both E2 and E1. You do need that, but it's favored for both. So it doesn't really help you tell the difference between them. Yeah, nucleophile strength. You can also, Angel said that as the charge of the nucleophile. So if it's a strong nucleophile, it'll favor 2. Weak, it'll favor 1. And then you want it to be secondary or tertiary, although that won't really help you tell between E1 or E2. You do want that for the reaction to go. Yes. You have to consider I'm going to call that mechanism. Like there's multiple steps for both of there's multiple steps for E1. There's one step for E2. And E1, you also have to consider rearrangement. Anytime there's a carbocation, you have to consider rearrangement. So I agree with that. There's multiple steps for E1. There's only one step for E2. I'm going to broadly categorize that as mechanism. And then you have to look for rearrangement in E1. What else do you think about with elimination reactions? This is all great stuff. I love it. Who said that? Hoffman and Zaitsev. That's right. For both of these, you have to consider Hoffman or Zaitsev. And how do you favor one over the other? What kind of nucleophile? If it's narrow, bulky, or you can classify that as small or large. If it's bulky, it'll go Hoffman. If it's narrow, it'll go Zaitsev, narrow or smaller. And what is the difference between Zaitsev and Hoffman product? I heard you say two different things that were both right. Zaitsev is more substituted and Zaitsev is more stable. It's more substituted, so the more substituted alkene is more stable. And then Hoffman is less substituted and less stable. So less of both. Okay, what else? They both need heat. That's a big thing that points to elimination reaction. You could have a tertiary leaving group and a strong or weak nucleophile, and either of those could go towards SN1 or SN2, right? If you have a strong nucleophile and a secondary leaving group, that's going to go towards SN2. If you have a weak nucleophile and a secondary leaving group, that's going to go towards SN1. But you can push it towards elimination by adding heat to give that energy that overcomes the activation energy that allows the elimination reaction to happen. So if you see heat, you should immediately think elimination. There's one other thing about elimination reactions that I want you to remember. Yes. That's right, anti-periplanar. So this, I'm going to categorize this as stereochemistry. For E2, you need to have your leaving group and the hydrogen that's getting taken opposite each other, and that will help you tell if it's going to give you the E or Z product if both of them are possible. So you have to consider whether or not it'll be Hoffman or Zaitsev product, and then you also have to consider if it's going to give you EZ or cis trans within E2. Within E1, it will be a mixture. Why will it be a mixture with E1? What'd you say? One more time? Yes. Well, it would be racemic if it was an addition, but I think you have the idea there, which is it goes through a carbocation mechanism. So it doesn't really matter. It's planar, right? So you don't need to everything be in the same plane because the leaving group is left already. And then you just have this carbocation and it doesn't matter. The hydrogen is going to get got and it'll give you both a mixture of both products. It does not matter. But it does matter in an E2. So you have to look out for anti-periplanar, the leaving group to be opposite each other. If it can rotate fully around a single bond, if it's not in a ring, you do that via Newman projection. If it's in a ring, you want the leaving group, I just picked chlorine as my leaving group, and the hydrogen to be axial and opposite of each other. Okay, so that's how you make alkenes. Hopefully today we'll get to the end of chapter 3 and you'll see one other way to make alkenes with something called a poisoned hydrogenation reaction, where it'll stop at a double bond. But for now, these are the big two ways we've learned how to make alkenes. What else did we learn from chapter 8? I'll give you a hint. It's reacting alkenes. Yes, adding water across a double bond. And what ways do we learn to add water across a double bond? Many ways. There's 3 main ways. Can anyone think of one for me? Adding water is a type of addition reaction. Yeah, all of the ones where you like add something across a double bond are considered to be addition reactions unless the double bond is cleaved, and that's called oxidative cleavage, is what we've learned on that so far. Acid catalyzed, somebody said something else. I thought. Did somebody say something else? Oh, you also said the same thing. Okay, acid catalyzed, that's one. And what's the mechanism that acid catalyzed goes through? What was that? It is similar to both E1 and SN1 in that it makes a carbocation. Yes, it's very similar to those reactions in that you'll have an alkene and you get an H plus. And so I call this going by a carbocation mechanism. So the most stable carbocation is formed. And then in this case, you'll have the water come. And from here, this is exactly like an SN1 reaction. You get your carbocation differently, but you should be able to draw this mechanism cold at this point. I've made you draw SN1 mechanisms over and over again. So I can see it being weird to get the carbocation, but once you've gotten the carbocation, you should know that the nucleophile is going to attack here, and then you'll get OH2 plus, and then you'll get a deprotonation step. And so you've added alcohol here and a hydrogen here, so that's called adding water across a double bond. What is this regiochemistry called, where the carbocation is the most stable? Markovnikov. I heard a few different people say it. Markovnikov is the products that formed is essentially the one where the most stable carbocation would have been formed. So in the bridged ion, you don't get a full free carbocation, but you still get the nucleophile adding as if the carbocation was right there. So it's very similar. Okay, that was a little hint for the next one, but what's the stereochemistry on this? On an, not this one specifically, because it's not a chiral center, but if it was, what would the stereochemistry be? Would you get syn addition of the H and the OH, anti, or a mixture? It's a mixture because of why? Why is it a mixture? The carbocation. The carbocations are always to blame for mixtures pretty much in this case. There's one instance where it's not a carbocation, why there's a mixture, but essentially you get this carbocation right here and it's planar, just like in an SN1 reaction. So just like in an SN1 reaction, that oxygen can add to the top or the bottom, which means wherever the hydrogen is added, the oxygen will either be on the same side as it or the opposite side of it. So you get a racemic mixture. Okay, and then one of the other two other ways? Oxymercuration, demercuration. What mechanism does that go through? It's similar to an SN2, but not exactly like an SN2. These have similarities to your substitution reactions. Not exactly. It has a weird, when the initial thing forms, it's called something specific. Instead of forming a full carbocation, it forms something else. Yes, a mercuranium ion, you can also, who said that? Okay, that's what I thought. You can also call it a bridged ion. Either one of those is correct. Mercuranium is specifically with the mercury. Later on, we have a brominium, so that's with bromine. But if you're just trying to be vague, it goes by a bridged ion mechanism. So that goes through this weird Hg, OAC, where there's still a positive charge, partial positive. It's not a free carbocation. Because it's not a free carbocation, we don't see what? No rearrangement. But because it's a partial carbocation, the nucleophile still attacks there. So what's the regiochemistry? The carbocation is still attacking where the more positive one would have formed. What is that? It's still Markovnikov because it's still attacking in the same position. So even though it's not forming a full carbocation, or we're not getting the most stable carbocation necessarily actually forming, the more positive charge is going to be focused on the same position because it's going through a very similar mechanism. It's just not exactly the same. So there won't be any rearrangement, but overall your regiochemistry will still be the same. And so I kind of like to think of this as, okay, so we found a way to add water across a double bond, great, but it has like got a bug, right? The bug is that rearrangement happens. So then chemists came up with like adding water across a bond 2.0, it fixes the bug, and now we don't get rearrangement and we still get our Markov-Nikov addition. But what if somebody wants their reaction to not do Markov-Nikov? Then we have anti-Markov-Nikov. That's like our third one. So I kind of think of it as like, Windows puts out like Windows 2.0. Back in the day, there was AOL. Do you guys remember that? There would be different versions of AOL, and you'd have to get an actual CD and put it on your computer. Maybe I'm a little bit older than y'all. Anyway, so it's kind of the same thing. It's like an updated version. It solves problems in the other one, which really, this isn't a problem if you want rearrangement, but if you don't want rearrangement, it is a problem. Okay, so oxymercuration and demercuration, there's no rearrangement. It goes through Markov-Nikov regiochemistry. Does anyone remember what this stereochemistry of this is? A full carbocation is not formed, and it's similar to an SN2 reaction. It initially adds anti. So when you get your first addition, you'll have your OH attack over here, and your mercury is still over here. That step is an anti-addition. However, the step that replaces your mercury with just a plain old hydrogen, this is called a reduction reaction with NABH4. It actually goes through what's called a radical mechanism, which is very similar to carbocation in that it will give you a racemic mixture. So that step scrambles your initial anti-addition, and it gives you a mixture. So the stereochemistry in both of these is not controlled. You're going to get a mixture of different stereochemical products in both of these. It's important, though, that you know that it attacks from the backside, just like an SN2 reaction does, because what other reactions go through a very similar mechanism with the bridged ion? That goes through a boxed instead of a triangle. So I can see why that's close. It's confusing, but not quite there. There's another one that literally makes the same triangle, makes the exact same bridged ion, but just with a different thing at the top than mercury. Bromine, you get the brominium ion. So when you're adding halogens across a double bond, it goes through that same thing, but there's no step where you replace your bromine with hydrogen. So you do get a solid anti-addition on that. So it's really helpful for you to kind of understand, like, if I'm adding water across the double bond with oxymercuration, demercuration, initially it's anti, but it gets scrambled, which is why it's different than adding bromines across a double bond, which those are anti too. And then also if you make halohydrons, which is when you add the bromine in any other solvent other than CCl4, any solvent that can act as a nucleophile, basically, that will also add anti. So I think unless you kind of recognize why that one's different, it gets very confusing. Okay. And then the last one, you said it, so I'm going to take that as your hydroboration oxidation. And I can see how this is confusing, but actually it doesn't have the full bridged ion. It goes through a transition state that looks like a box, honestly. There's a hydrogen here and the BH2 over here. So it looks kind of like a box. You don't need to know how to recreate this mechanism, but I think it's helpful to see because this BH2 over here is bigger than this hydrogen, which is why the hydrogen, due to stereochemistry, lines up on the more substituted side, which is why this one and this one only will add water anti-Markov-Nikov. So the initial addition is actually just the hydrogen and the BH2 over here, and then that also goes through a step. This step does not scramble stereochemistry. It doesn't go through the radical reaction, but it'll replace your BH2 with an OH. So that adds anti-Markov-Nikov. Okay, and what's the stereochemistry? It doesn't get scrambled. It goes through a different mechanism than this. So the initial addition is the same. It's syn, because you can literally imagine this BH2 coming down and bonding. It's one molecule that forms this complex, so it can't be like adding on opposite sides, right? The molecule has to be on the same side, just like we learned with the hydrogenation reaction, that the H2 is basically just kind of picked up. It's very, very similar. So because of that, these will both be wedges or they'll both be dashes. Okay, that's the additions of water, and I think they're a really good foundation to understand everything else that we do in this chapter, because all the other addition reactions in this chapter go through very similar mechanisms. So what other ways did we learn? I'm going to spread it out. What other things did we learn to add? Or did you have a specific question? It's too small. Yeah, I'm trying to fit everything on this teeny tiny page. The next one is just going to be a list, so I'll just do it like right over here. What other types of additions did we learn? I made a nice announcement of it for you today, but try not to look. Try to think of it on your own. We learned one that goes really similarly with this. It's adding like an acid of a halogen across the double bond. So like hydrochloric acid or hydrobromic acid, those will be the big ones you'll see. And the reason it goes through a very similar mechanism is the alkene attacks this very significantly positive portion. You don't actually need an acid catalyst because it is an acid itself. It is the acid catalyst, but that will attack the positive portion, and then the Cl- will act like your nucleophile. So these two are very, very, very much like an SN1 reaction once you get that carbocation. You just have a nucleophile attacking at the positive part. Okay. What else did we learn? I already talked about one of them. Oh, that's not one I talked about. Good job. This is not quite an addition. I guess you could categorize it, but it's different than the nucleophilic addition, where the alkene is what's attacking, or the electrophilic addition, sorry, where the alkene is attacking that electrophile. But it is like oxidative cleavage. So I think of that as it will literally come right in and break open this double bond, and it just adds an oxygen on that side. It's replacing bonds to carbon with bonds to oxygen. So it looks like that. You can literally just cut it open and put an oxygen on each side, and it kind of looks like a vase. Cute. If you used KMNO4 instead of O3, how would these products be different? Yes, KMNO4 is a stronger oxidizing agent, and you're going to learn all about oxidizing agents in chapter 12. So I kind of almost wish we left this for chapter 12, but it is fair game for other professors to ask you about after you leave this class. But it's a stronger oxidizing agent, which means it wants to add more oxygen. So if you do hot KMNO4, this aldehyde actually gets converted to a carboxylic acid. And if you have a formaldehyde, it'll go all the way to CO2. It'll replace both of these carbons. I probably won't ask you about that, but someone else might. Now, what if you had cold KMNO4? How many OH? 2H. What is that called when it adds 2 OH? There's a name for it, a blank diol. It's a name I hate to say. It's vicinal, like it's in the vicinity. I always have to think really hard about saying it. Vicinal diol. If it's gym diol, they're on the same carbon. If they're next to each other, it's vicinal diol. I don't know why that's so hard for me to say, but it is really hard for me to say. Does this add syn or anti? It adds syn. You don't need to know the mechanism for it. That's one that it's useful for you to just memorize. But you can see why it adds syn if you want to go look at the mechanism. It is in your slides, but I don't make you memorize that mechanism or be able to recreate it. Is someone going in and out there? I feel like I keep hearing that door opening and closing. Huh. Okay, weird. Oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense. I'm like, is there like a creeper like hanging out right in that doorway? I feel like as a teacher in 2022, you have to be really aware of like strangers entering your classroom. So I'm always like a little on edge when that happens. Okay, one summer we had a guy just come sit in our class all the time, and it's because he was stalking one of my students. I know, and I like it was a really big class, and he was able to like kind of go under the radar because it was like 200 students. I was the TA that summer, and so until that student like brought it up, we didn't realize that he wasn't actually taking the class. Ah, creeps. That's also why small class sizes are better, and that's also why when people are like being sketchy, I'm like, what's going on? Okay. Great. So this one, you do need to know the stereochemistry of these. It makes an sp3 hybridized situation, so you don't need to know the stereochemistry, right? It's literally cleaving that double bond in half. What else did we learn about? What other ones go by the bridged mechanism? The bridged ion mechanism. Somebody already answered this question today, so I know you guys know. You're just scared. Be brave. What? Halohydrin is one of them, absolutely. So one of them is just plain X2. So Cl2 and Br2 are the biggest ones you'll see in CCl4. And that's just adding halogens across a double bond. It goes by the same brominium or chlorinium bridged ion. And how does that add, syn or anti? Adds anti. And then if you change out the solvent for water or alcohol, it gives you a new product. It's specifically called halohydrin if it adds with water because it gets OH and X. I've tried to find if there's a name that's like commonly used for using alcohol where it'll give you like an ether. I haven't really found a satisfying one, so I just call it like halohydrin with alcohol as a solvent or to make it ether. Okay, and then you can also change the solvent on this oxymercuration demercuration. If you do that in water, that also makes an ether. So when you're thinking, or in alcohol, it makes an ether. It's already in water. So when you're thinking of chapter 11, which is making alcohols and ethers, you now know 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ways to make an alcohol and 2 ways to make an ether. So you're going to kill it in chapter 11, right? Because you already know it. That's right. I'm going to believe that that's true. Okay, is there anyone that we missed? It's very possible that we did. These are the only ones I can think of right now. But I might have missed one. I don't have this just like off the top of my head. Okay, I wanted a set 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I feel like I might have missed one because I think I put 10 on the list that I posted today. But make sure that you know all of those. It helps if you know the mechanism that they go by because that helps you understand if they add Markovnikov or if they add anti-Markovnikov. It also helps you know if they add with anti or syn stereochemistry. And also it helps you because you don't have to memorize as much, right? If you know the brominium ion, I got you. If you know the brominium ion and the mercurium ion and then the brominium ion for halohydrin, you know that all of those add Markovnikov. So the first electrophilic thing adds where the most stable carbocation would go on the other side. And then they all add anti. You just need to remember that one gets scrambled, right? So like you can just remember all that happening with just knowing one mechanism. And then the same thing with the H plus addition. Okay, well, H plus addition, after you add that, it gives you a carbocation, whether that's acid catalyzed or you're just using HX of any kind. And from there, it's SN1. You already know that. So then you don't have to memorize anything except you have to recognize that an alkene is going to attack an H+. So I don't want you to memorize except the reagents that go with each one of those things. That's worthwhile to memorize. And then these are worthwhile to memorize. But this part right here. But other than that, I really want you to be able to think about what's actually happening to reduce the amount of memorizing you have to do and to help you as you go into ochem 2 because ochem 2 is like this chapter, where you're going to learn a crap ton of ways to make something and a crap ton of ways to react it forward. So if you can think about patterns that you already recognize and how you can keep those patterns in your mind instead of just like memorizing everything, your time at ochem 2 is going to be a lot easier. And while I really emphasize the patterns and you being able to do that, other professors might not. So you're going to be responsible on your own for recognizing those patterns and for not memorizing, but for deeply understanding. That other people don't put as high a priority on it, facilitating that as I do. So I kind of want you to get into that habit now and practice that now. Okay, great. Did you have something else from chapter 8 that you remembered? That's chapter 8, the O3. It really is, you don't need to know the mechanism for it. It's just like, this is a reaction that happens with alkenes, and it's useful if you're then going to do, there's a lot of reactions in ochem 2 that happen at carbonyl carbons. So if you want a carbonyl carbon, you can use oxidative cleavage. But also a funny thing that one of my students, so my research is asking how people feel about learning organic chemistry. And a big feedback I get is like, I'm never going to use this after I leave this class, which I'm like, I mean, depending, but yeah, I could see that. And a person was like, I never am going to need to know oxidative cleavage or whatever the F. And I was like, that's true. I guess I wouldn't really need to know that if I wasn't in this field. But if you're staying in this field, you do need to know that. And also, if you're taking the MCAT or the ACS exam, there are questions like this that they want you to know the answer to. So, but it really makes me laugh when students are like, there's no reason. I'm like, I get it. I want us to reduce the ochem curriculum. Half of what I teach because you need to know it for the next class, which I hate. I wish we could just like spend all semester just talking about the way electrons move, and you wouldn't have to memorize anything, and we just dig in on like, this mechanism happens because of this, and it's driven by this, and that would be delightful. But sadly, I can't reform the whole system just because I found research that provides evidence that it's bad. Although I want to. Okay. I think this is most of what I asked you to do from chapter 8, but this idea of understanding them, that's really what I want you to do from chapter 8. And I think I did make a comprehensive list, not with all the like details, but a comprehensive list of the reactions that we went over in class yesterday on an announcement for you. And also, you can do this without me, remember. This is like, you might not have a professor that does the same thing, but before you get to class, you can ask yourself, what did we learn last class? Like as you're walking up, you can quiz yourself on this, and just interrupting that forgetting process and reminding yourself of what you did the day before or the week before, whatever your last class period was, that helps you learn. I do this to try to help you learn how to solidify information in your mind. So I'm trying to prepare you to go into next semester without me. Okay. So that's what we've covered so far in chapter 8. And part of why I wanted to review that is because now we're getting into alkynes. And guess what? Alkynes act a lot like alkenes because they have an excess of pi electrons. I really should have done this the other way. So understanding how alkenes work means you don't have to memorize alkynes really at all, which makes life easy. Here's the slides with the, in case you wanted to see them, with the mechanism for ozone and how it works. And then the KMNO4 cleavage as well. Oh, they don't even do the mechanism for that on here. So it's just kind of an overall idea. Okay, so if we now are looking at alkynes, surprise, surprise, if we put the same reagents in the same conditions, like X2, some kind of halogen, in a non-reactive solvent, it will add 2 halogens across the double bond twice. So it adds it across a triple bond, and then it becomes a double bond, and then it will add again. So the addition reaction actually just happens 2 times, and they will add anti to each other, but it doesn't matter that they add anti to each other because they're both going to add, and so it's not a chiral center anymore, but it does go through the same exact mechanism process. I meant to have this slide before, that now we're going to work on reactions of alkenes. So sorry. Or of alkynes. I don't know why that one was there. Maybe I just was thinking, oh, I'll show them that it's really similar. I don't know. I made these when I was really sick and tired. So, okay, so synthesis of alkynes. We talked about how to synthesize alkenes by elimination reactions. The way that you synthesize alkynes, we actually already learned also in chapter 7 is by this NaNH2. It's a pretty powerful base. NH3 already has a pK of 38, right? So that was pretty basic on its own, just plain old NH3. NH2 minus has lost another hydrogen, so it has 2 lone pairs and it's negatively charged. It's even more nucleophilic than, like, in the right conditions than OH minus, because its pKa is so much lower than water, right? So if you look at the trend, it's very significantly nucleophilic. So it's good at doing an elimination reaction twice. So it does once to get a double bond, and then this is the first time that y'all have seen, I mean, in this reaction last chapter too, an elimination or substitution reaction happen on an sp2 hybridized carbon, right? Always before, to do a substitution or elimination reaction, we had an sp3 hybridized carbon. This is the only exception to that. That will do an elimination reaction on an sp2 hybridized carbon, because then it just basically acts again to get our carbon-carbon triple bond. Now, do you remember what happens if this right here is a hydrogen instead of an R group in these conditions with excess NH2 minus? What's the pKa of that if that was a hydrogen? What's the pKa of a carbon-carbon triple bond with a hydrogen off of it? You guys should know this by your final. It's a good, this is one of those, find the gaps in your understanding. It's 25. And you were close, yeah. 25, and then what's the alkene, if it was an alkene? See, now I've unearthed a gap, and now I'm going to make you answer the other ones. Alkenes are 45, and alkanes? Yeah, so see, you just had to get that one part of your memory jogged. Okay, so if you have a pK of 25, that's relatively acidic. It's not very acidic, but it's acidic enough that if you have a really strong nucleophile, it could do an acid-base reaction. So you could have an acid-base reaction if that's a terminal alkyne. And this is just more examples of that. This is something I probably should put it in those special details, but this is something that you can make an alkyne if you first turn a ketone into a geminal dichloride, and you can do the elimination reaction this way too. I don't think that this is very important for you to know right now. But it basically, if the leaving groups are on the same carbon or different carbons, it still works and makes your carbon-carbon triple bond. Okay, and then, sorry, my chapter outline's terrible, but if you have a terminal alkyne, so an alkyne at the end with a hydrogen, your NH2 minus can take that hydrogen, and then you have what's known as a carb anion. Carb anions are negatively charged carbons, and they're relatively nucleophilic, and they can be used in an SN2 reaction or other reactions that we'll see moving forward in the next few chapters. So if you have 2 leaving groups on either adjacent carbons or the same carbon, you can create an alkyne, and if it's at the end, you can then turn it into an anion, and that is a way to react an alkyne forward. So if we combined this with a primary, oh, I just spit gross, a primary chlorine, what reaction do you think would happen? If you combine this with a primary chlorine, primary alkyl chloride, it'd be an SN2, right? Because this is negatively charged, so it's a strong enough nucleophile to do an SN2 reaction. And primary alkyl chloride is a good leaving group. So what you'll start to see, I think it really starts in this chapter, and it doesn't really stop after this chapter, is you'll start to see something like if we had our 2 leaving groups on here, and the first step would be NaNH2 with liquid NH3. And then the second step, and it would say in excess, and then the second step would be a carbon chain with some kind of leaving group on it, or a 6-membered ring with a leaving group on it. And then you will have to know that the first step is one kind of reaction to generate your nucleophile, and then the second step is that reaction actually happening. We had some of that in chapters 6 and 7 in the practice problems. It was like you had H- and it deprotonated an alcohol, turning that into the nucleophile, and then it attacked. And so you've seen that a little bit before, but it gets much more prevalent starting from this chapter onward, is we're going to start to make you combine all the different reactions you know. And now you don't just know acid-base reactions. Now you know acid-base substitutions, eliminations, additions, cleavages. So you've got a lot that you can work your mind through. Okay, so here's an example of that. The nucleophilic anion coming and attacking the R group and kicking it out. And then you've made a new carbon-carbon bond. So this is one of the first times you've seen a new bond being made between two carbons. This is the first time you've been able to generate carbon-carbon bonds. Usually, so far, you've been generating bonds between hydrogens and carbon, or between heteroatoms that are nucleophilic and carbon, right? So this is now you have the power to make carbon-carbon bonds. And what if you wanted to turn this into an alkane? What would you add to it? Hydrogen heat and some kind of metal catalyst to do a what kind of reaction? You can tell me, or anyone. That's right. So now you can make any alkane that you want within reason. You've figured out how to do that. How exciting. Now you're able to manipulate atoms. That's amazing. I think sometimes we lose sight of that when you're in those labs upstairs and you're like adding something to something and then waiting at heat for like 100 hours, and then you have to like watch the melting point and you're like, I do not give a crap, get me out of here. I get it. That's how your TA probably feels too, except they've had to watch you do this reaction like 3 times that week already. But what you're doing, what you're losing sight of in the mundaneness of that situation, is you're manipulating atoms and you're making new molecules. Like at one point in one of your labs, you're isolating caffeine from tea. You can't go home and decaffeinate tea. You have no idea how to do that by yourself at home. You buy decaffeinated tea, but you can go upstairs in a lab and decaffeinate tea with instructions following step-by-step things. You're manipulating atoms and separating molecules out from each other. How powerful is that? That's incredible. And that's how people make medicine, like, right? That's how people give you Tylenol to save your life. I think we lose how mundane these things, like, oh, it's so mundane. We like take medicine all the time. But the fact that someone figured out how to manipulate atoms and give you exactly what you need within your brain chemistry. So they figured out how to manipulate the atoms, they figured out what your brain or body chemistry needs, and they figured out how to make it safe for you to take, is insane. So this feels boring, I think, sometimes because we've zoomed in so far that we don't think about how incredible it is that we can do these things. I'll get off my soapbox. This is why chemistry is so cool. Okay, so essentially, if you have this anion, it can undergo other reactions, especially like substitution and elimination reactions, and you'll actually see even more reactions happening as you go into the next few chapters, especially at carbonyl carbon. You'll start to see carbons as nucleophiles more and more often. So here's just another example of that, where you're doing your SN2 reaction, and then you can also go through elimination reactions with it too. And if you want to turn that into an alkane, you can do a hydrogenation reaction like we talked about. And this is where we're going to talk about a new way to make alkanes with poisoned catalysts. So the way I talk to my students about this, I was like, oh, this is like you're going down a stair. Normally, if you start at the top of the stairs, your goal is to get all the way to the bottom of the stairs. So normally, if you start at an alkyne, you're trying to get all the way to an alkane. You only stop halfway through the stair if something is wrong. Like you're only frozen in the middle of a stair if something bad is happening. Like in Harry Potter, there's like a vanishing step and he gets stuck in it in the books. That's a nerdy deep cut. It's okay if you don't remember. Or like if you hurt your ankle, like, or there's usually not a good reason. You're just like, I'm now stopped in the middle of these stairs. So that's the same thing with hydrogenation. Usually, the only way we can stop halfway through the hydrogenation reaction is if you introduce something that's poisoned. So we call these poisoned catalysts that allow for semi-hydrogenation of alkynes. And my students were like, oh, we're sabotaging. They decided it was called sabotaged. Sabotage catalyst that it's like you've made a trap in your stairs and it's going to break away and now the people can't keep going downstairs. So I thought that was a funny visual, is that there's like someone sabotaging your stairs. I don't know. I thought it was funnier than poisoned. So there's a few different ones that can do that. There's P2. This is sometimes called Lindlar's catalyst. You should be able to recognize it as it being said P2, or it'll be NiB, nickel boride. This is how it's made in situ. I don't think you need to recognize these reagents. You do need to recognize Ni2B, nickel boride, or P2, or Lindlar's catalyst. All of those names are fair game. I don't think you need to know how it's generated. Oh wait, sorry, this one's P2. This is Lindlar's catalyst. My bad. These all mean the same thing clearly in my brain. Lindlar's catalyst does the same thing, where it'll stop at an alkene. Do you think these are trans alkenes or cis alkenes? Do you think the hydrogens are adding cis or trans? Syn or anti? Question marks. That's what I'm getting. I heard both cis question mark, trans question mark. So you can have different ones that do different things, but these two, nickel boride P2s or Lindlar's catalyst, this is why they've combined into one thing in my mind, because they do the same thing. These will both add with the hydrogens on the same side. They do a syn addition. And that's because you're still kind of getting the same idea where the metal is your catalyst. So you can think of the hydrogen still hanging out on the metal. It's just slightly less effective. So that's why it's still adding syn. There's one that's different. So I've put these in my brain together, nickel boride P2 and Lindlar's catalyst. If you're like, which one's which, you could tell just then I don't know which one's which, because they just do the same thing. So all these put the same flag in my brain. So you need to be able to recognize them and recognize what they do. If you see any of these things, nickel boride P2, palladium and calcium carbonate and quinoline, or if it just says Lindlar's, you need to know all of these. All these are poison catalyst, and they do a syn addition. They're just different ways of saying the same thing, or different reagents that do the same thing. There is one that will let us go trans. Again, it's the thing where there's a bug in our reaction, and so we have a 2.0 that fixes it up for us. It could have been 1:30 and I would have had no idea. I was having so much fun talking about this just now. I was like, crap, what time is it? And that's called a dissolving metal reduction. And a good way for you to remember this, a good way for me to remember this is if the other ones have metal as the catalyst, I think of the metal being in one place and the hydrogen coming onto it, and then my alkyne coming and getting the hydrogen. If there's a dissolving metal reduction, the metal is all up in there. It's all over the place. It's dissolved and spread throughout your solvent, which means it can attack the hydrogens on either side, or attach the hydrogens on either side. So dissolving metal reduction is the only one that gives you a trans alkene. It's the only one that adds the hydrogens anti. So if you see lithium, so that's the metal, gets dissolved in liquid ammonium, smells great, like Windex, and it's very, very cold, that is going to give you a dissolving metal reduction. So when I think of this, I think of H2, platinum, palladium, carbon. That's going to take my alkynes all the way to the bottom of the stairs. If there's anything else with the H2 besides just H2, that's not a good sign. It's probably poisoned. It's been tampered with. So then P2, Lindlar's, palladium, quinoline, or nickel boride, not just plain nickel, but nickel with boride on it. I'm like, oh, it's been messed with. So those are going to stop, and they're going to give me an alkene that's cis. It's going to add syn. It's going to stop halfway down my stair step. And dissolving metal reduction is like its whole own thing. It doesn't even have hydrogen in here, right? It's liquid. It's lithium with liquid ammonia or ammonium. I can never remember if it's ammonia or ammonium. Does anyone remember which one's NH4 plus? This is ammonia. Okay, great. That I can never remember that. Liquid ammonia, and then it's very, very cold. This is totally different. Usually what happens to me, honestly, when I see this on an exam, I'm always like, what the flip? Like, I don't know. I have no idea what this does. And then I'm like, oh, wait, I know, NH3. I know what this does. There's lithium, there's a metal, it's getting dissolved in something. This gives me my transalkene. So honestly, this is one that it's like kind of hard for me to have clues about, whereas the other ones are a little bit easier to recognize. So you'll be responsible for knowing all of these for your final exam and moving forward into ochem 2. And then there's just a few examples for you on it where it adds anti or adds syn. So you can kind of see how it happens. So that is a new way to make alkenes, right? That's a way that we've just learned to make alkenes. So up to this point, we've only known elimination reactions to make alkenes. Now we can do a poisoned hydrogenation to stop at an alkene as well. So we can make alkenes from elimination reactions with a good leaving group on them, or we can make alkenes from an alkyne. Either of those are a way we can make alkenes. And one thing I like to do to kind of summarize things like that come from different chapters is I will draw the functional group like an alkene, and I'm like, here are all the ways to make the alkene, and here are all the ways I've learned to react it forward. And so I kind of make these circular charts. It's like all these arrows towards it and what reagents I need to make this, and then all these arrows away from it, what happens if I react it with different things. That's something I do as like kind of a study sheet. Different than a chart. Normally I like charts. Okay, and then we already talked about how if you do alkynes with any kind of similar addition reaction as we had with alkenes, they'll go through the similar mechanism. So like you can add halides and it'll add anti, it'll just do it twice, and then same thing with HBr, HCl, HI. It'll add in the same way where it follows Markov-Nikov's rule. The alkyne attacks, you get a carbocation, and the nucleophile goes where the carbocation is. So this is nothing new. This is just happening twice instead of happening once. This is still stuff you've already seen before in this chapter, and even similar to what you've seen in substitution reactions earlier. And this is when I said, remember, if it's vicinal, they're next to each other. So vicinal diols are next to each other. Geminal things or gem things are on the same. So vicinal diols next to each other. Geminal diols on the same carbon. Vicinal halides next to each other. That's what you usually get with the X2 with alkynes. Geminal halides are on the same carbon. So that is one more thing to kind of think about when you're doing these reactions, but it goes through the same mechanism, so you don't have to memorize that. You just know that it goes for the same mechanism. And this is just walking you through the mechanism of how that happens, but it's something you've seen many times before. This goes through a radical reaction. So we're going to talk about this more in chapter 10. So up to this point, we've only learned one way to do anti-Markovnikov, and that's with BH3-THF. You are not responsible yet. You will be responsible when we finish chapter 10 for knowing that if you do the addition reactions in the presence of peroxides, both for alkynes and alkenes, it actually makes it go anti-Markovnikov. But if I make you memorize that now, that's all you'll be doing, is you'll be memorizing it. If I wait and show it to you next unit, you'll get to see the mechanism that it goes by, and you'll actually be able to understand why it does that. And of course, that's my teaching philosophy. So I want you to be aware that we're going to learn a new way to make anti-additions, but you're not responsible for it just yet. I just don't want you to think you have the whole story and then I pull out the rug from you in the next chapter where I'm like, aha, here's a new way to go anti-Markovnikov. And if while you're preparing for your final exam, this comes up and you're like, what? I thought HBr goes Markovnikov. Well, put a little star by it and know we'll learn about it in radical reactions in chapter 10. Okay, and then we already talked about this because I had the slides out of order. It'll do anti-additions. Okay, so up to this point, we have done everything in this chapter. We've done synthesis of alkenes, including hydrogenation with poison catalyst. I added that in just now. We've done reactions of alkenes. We did addition reactions, all of them. Oxidative cleavage, all of those. And then we did synthesis of alkynes, which you usually will only see if you have 2 leaving groups and you do the NH2 minus. And that leads very well into reactions of alkynes where you can convert it to an anion. It'll do a substitution reaction. Or you can do any of the basically same additions that we already did with alkenes, and they'll act exactly the same way. With alkynes, they'll just usually happen twice. And then that's the other reaction of alkynes we already talked about is hydrogenation with poison catalysts to get H2, or you can hydrogenate it all the way down to alkanes, but you guys already knew that one. So the very last thing is retrosynthesis, and I think this can be a big scary word, and sometimes you'll hear words like synthons to see like, oh, if we break it down, it's this or this, but I don't like those. So all retrosynthesis is really is looking at your starting material in your product and predicting what is going to happen in between those. So on your quiz today, there was we won't talk about it in detail because there are some people who haven't finished, but there was a question where you already did retrosynthesis, where you basically were like, which thing do I react with to get this? That's retrosynthesis. You have already started doing retrosynthesis. And that will come up, I think the way that comes up most often on your final is there's not a lot of free response, especially if you're going into there's no free response on your final. If you're going to Dr. Berhe, he has less free response. Sometimes if you're in Dr. Dandekar or Dr. Richmond, they'll have questions that are like, which reagents would you use to convert from this to this? There'll be some of those multiple choice questions on your final. You won't have to generate that for me. But sometimes they'll have you do it freely, like a free response where you have to come up with your own reagents. So be mentally prepared for that. But that's all retrosynthesis is. We have 2 more minutes of class, so I'm going to milk it for all it's worth. So here is an example. How would you synthesize this? You sometimes will be given starting materials. So like in this case, you aren't, you can just come up with anything. And I can think of like 4 different ways to make this. If we start with an external alkene, we can do H plus and H2O. We can do oxymercuration oxymercuration, demercuration. If we have an internal alkene, actually any of our additions of alcohol or any of our additions of water across the double bond will work because it's symmetrical, right? So you could have proposed literally 5 different things just with what you know right now to make this right here. And that's not even counting substitution reactions. If you had a leaving group that left and an oxygen that came and attacked, that's the 6th one, right? So this is where ochem starts to, I think it starts to depart like pat answers, and you start to have to solve things like puzzles. So you're not always going to have one right answer. And sometimes you'll see, even on my videos, if you keep watching them in ochem 2, on some of the recitation homework, me and my colleague came up with different answers to the same questions. And so I'll say, like, this is how I would solve it. You can solve it any way that actually works, but check your work it backwards to make sure that it does actually work the way you think it will. So that's kind of a tip for retrosynthesis is once you've proposed the reaction, you're much more comfortable working reactions forward than backwards. So work it forwards with what you have, and a lot of times you can catch your own problems. And then if you want to practice, there's just a couple different ways that you can, or there's a couple different options for you to practice on here. And then there's also a lot of multiple choice questions in this one where it's like, which reagents give you this addition of alcohol or this addition of bromine and alcohol or whatever. And that's it. We finished chapter 8. Woo! Y'all aren't as excited as me. Okay, we're going to do a radical reactions tomorrow and a recitation tomorrow. And then on next week, not Monday. Don't come to class on Monday. We'll finish everything up and then do our review. Please, please, please start studying for your final now. Okay. Did I already end that meeting? Hopefully I did. What's up? Yes.